Ethnic cleansing of Danube Swabians. After Hitler's invasion of Russia, the Communists, now on the side of the Soviet Union, entered the war they had rejected just a couple of months before. No less than 6 major resistance groups in the unoccupied mountains of Bosnia made sorties against German supply lines to Greece, but mostly they fought each other. The partisans, due to Churchill's support, soon gained the upper hand. They attacked isolated bases. When the outnumbered Germans surrendered, they killed them on the spot. To satisfy the bloodlust of Tito's primitive fighters, their bodies were mutilated in a manner which is utterly revolting to civilized people. The Germans retaliated by burning the villages that harbored partisans and shooting 10 hostages for every German who was killed. Violence begets violence, and this practice only intensified the struggle. There were so many forces fighting in the mountains that the Germans didn't know who was who. It was a battle fought with the utmost cruelty by all sides, and the struggle took place far from Danube Swabian settlements, and they were not involved in the conflict. In the fall of 1944, Tito's anti-fascist council gathered in Bosnia and passed a resolution which consisted of 3 main points. When the Yugoslav state was re-established, those of German nationality, 650,000 people, the largest non-Slavic ethnic group in pre-war Yugoslavia, were to be dispossessed and deprived of all human rights, including the right to life. Their property was to be distributed among Tito's rough, unlettered fighters who were his main support. This was to be achieved through 1. Mass liquidation, 2. Mass deportation, 3. Extermination through starvation and forced labor in concentration camps. Partisans would acquire the best homes in the country, as well as farms and livestock of the dispossessed. Tito, the great benefactor, was indeed a good man who gave his minions and peasant fighters something worthy fighting for. They didn't have to work for it at all. All they had to do was kill, kill, kill. As the Red Army drove through the neat Danube Swabian villages and towns in what was the Hungarian Bachka, Baranja, Serbia, Banat, Croatian Sirmiria, and Slavonia, partisan bands followed in its wake and took possession of their promised land. But first they had to liquidate the Swabians. The method varied from place to place, but the result was all the same: death by unspeakable torture. It happened so often that it was the rule rather than the exception. Their first victims were usually the mayor, the town council, priests, teachers, merchants, or anyone some partisan took exception to. The victims' hands were tied with wire, and they were taken to a building where they were slaughtered by bloodthirsty partisans who had long ago lost their humanity. As the victims lay helpless in the center, thoroughly inebriated butchers danced the kola in a circle and sang partisan songs. From time to time, they would break off into a frenzy of bloodletting, taking turns stabbing their prisoners to death, while relishing their screams and moans. Hefty partisankas, those were female partisans, took particular delight in cutting off the genitals of the victims while they still showed signs of life. The killing usually ended in the wee hours of the morning when the prisoners had been beaten to an unrecognizable pulp, and their tormentors slumped onto the blood-soaked floor in a drunken stupor. When all the men in the community had been rounded up and those appeared to be better off than the others, the so-called hated capitalists, had been selected, they were marched out of town where they first had to dig their graves, and were then shot and buried. Others were deported to slave labor camps in Yugoslavia and Russia, where they were worked to death. The young women, between the ages of 16 and 40, were rounded up and sent to Russian cattle cars, where they slaved away during hard labor at ancient coal mines and building sites. When they were released 5 years later, only 1 in 4 ever saw their family again. The broken and ailing women who could not return to their homes were sent to Germany. Some found family members and resumed normal lives. But practically all of these women bear physical scars from which they will suffer for the rest of their lives. The rest, the handicapped, women with young children, and the aged, were forced out of their homes by well-armed partisans. One can only imagine the tears and wailing of utterly defenseless women with small children whose husbands were sent away, some of whom probably also were caring for parents or grandparents, when they were given only a few minutes to leave their homes forever. Their house, furniture, photo albums, garden, pets, animals, and 1,000 memories had to be left behind. They marched along dusty roads in columns of 4, accompanied by an armed escort. It must have been a sad sight. Women carrying small bundles of but a few necessities, all which the partisans would have allowed them to take, and their small children clutching their mothers' skirts, crying uncontrollably, while guards threatened them with guns and yelled at them to get moving. Old men who could not keep up were shot on the spot, in front of family members and grandchildren. Their bodies were thrown in a ditch. Old women fared no better. If they could not keep a steady pace, they were severely beaten by the guards. A dozen Danube Swabian towns, like Gakawa, had been designated as a concentration camp by Tito's most despicable henchmen. The available houses in these towns had been stripped of their furniture, and the internees, as they were officially called, had to sleep on a straw-covered floor, 30 to a room. Others slept in barns and stables. There was no fuel provided for heat or cleaning materials. Since the intention was to starve them to death, the only food they obtained in the camp was swill. Many, however, were able to sustain their lives by sneaking out of camp at night at the risk of their lives and begging for food from local Serbs and Hungarians, former neighbors, who were mostly sympathetic and compassionate people. Had that not been so, surely no one would have survived these camps. Because there were so few survivors, the Tito regime closed the camps in the spring of 1948. Those who perished from maltreatment, starvation, and disease were buried in nearby mass graves, where no markers may be put to remind the passers-by of the atrocities that were committed there. The emaciated few who remained alive escaped into nearby Hungary and made their way to the west. As soon as partisans had taken over a town, they selected young Danube Swabian women, preferably blondes, who were torn from their families and taken to a compound in Pančevo, across the river from Belgrade. There they were kept like caged animals to satisfy the sexual lusts of Tito's elite troops and foul-smelling partisan brutes. The girls who were from decent homes were physically and sexually abused by the most loathsome of creatures. If they resisted, they were shot. Theirs was a hopeless life, and there was no one there to help them out of their misery. Their lives were mercifully short, and when the inevitable happened, they all became affected with syphilis. To prevent it from spreading, the local army commander ordered the remaining 150 women to be taken to a remote pasture, where they first had to strip off their clothing and then were shot to death. The reason they took off their clothes was that the partisans intended to sell them on the black market. In Yugoslavia at the time, used clothing was at a premium, but would not be sellable if they were riddled with bullet holes. About 40,000 orphan Danube Swabian children were left behind in the camps after their mothers, grandparents, and good neighbors had died of starvation or typhoid. As there was no one left to take care of them, they were taken to the communist children's homes in other parts of Yugoslavia, where they were given Slavic names. Consequently, they soon lost touch with their language and German identity. As Turks had done in the past centuries with their enemies' children, they were raised as Janissaries, fighters for Tito. Some of the 40,000 children, about 5,000 of which were older, aged 8 to 12 years, who remembered their German ancestry, were sent to deportation centers, such as Derventa, and each of those approximate 5,000 was put to death at a local sugar refinery. Ivan Baras, a Croatian prisoner who now lives in Germany, was an eyewitness to the atrocity. He, along with other prisoners, had taken the children from railway cars to the killing site and had a chance to speak to the confused and crying children. He was able to memorize some of the names and places from which they came. All of them were Danube Swabian communities in Bačka, Banat, Sirmiria, Baranja, and Slavonia. After the war, a different 5,000 of the orphan children were located, and with the aid of the German Red Cross, they were eventually reunited with relatives in the West. What happened to the other 30,000? No one seems to know. If they survived, two things are certain: that they would have been raised as Janissaries, and they would know nothing of their German background. From those who were released to the West, we know that they were led to believe that it was the Germans who had actually killed their parents. It's a cruel world.